Kia ora everyone. My name is Ainsley G and I am the General Manager here at Changing Minds. I want to acknowledge Ngāti Whātua and the whenua which we stand on, and I want to acknowledge the people that have gone before us and those that are here today with us to offer their support and contribution and expertise around mental health and addictions. I'm hoping that you're going to get some things out of tonight that you will take some things away to think about and enjoy yourselves. Changing Minds' mission is leading brave conversations to redefine mental health and addictions in Aotearoa. And our conversation and discussion tonight, I hope, will be doing some of that. I hope it will be exploring some territory that might be unknown, maybe even a little bit confronting or uncomfortable, but a space that really, really must be explored.
Addictions in New Zealand have become or have reached epidemic proportions, and not a lot is known about the pathology of addictions in this country, and it's about time we had an opportunity to shed some light.
I like the way the word construct is used in the title, because I think when you come to thinking about addiction, we're dealing with a concept that has different meaning for lots of different people. But behind it, I think, is perplexity about how the hell someone who's functioning well, has every reason to function well, how come they deteriorate over a long period of time and to such a degree? So family members living with someone who, despite knowledge and despite support and love, still continue to deteriorate, or their lives deteriorate, that's really perplexing, and I don't think we've got a clear answer for that. And that's why I think the word construct's good, because there's a lot of different ways of thinking about what drives that. One of them is looking at it as a moral weakness, that's one way of looking at it, and that can be helpful. One way of looking at it is a disease, that someone has something happening persistently in them that drives it, and that can be useful, particularly for family members in moving to not blaming themselves. Some people look at it as a learning, as something to do with what you've learnt to be, and that can be useful at times. I tend to look at it, this is my version of things, as a relationship. That essentially what's important here is that someone establishes a relationship with something that changes how they feel, and that relationship intensifies. And what's important there is the impact on other relationships. So as the relationship to the drug or gambling, whatever it is, intensifies, the quality of the relationships elsewhere, with work, with family, with children, they deteriorate. So it's that relationship between those two things which to me is important, and it's also important in terms of how we change it, because it's a process of change. I think here is about restoring the integrity of relationships over a long period of time. So that's my take on it. And who defines it? Well, I think those who are most harmed by it should have priority over what it is.
So from a clinician's perspective, you can ask someone how much they drink and they can tell you 24 bottles a day. And then you can ask them how much, you can ask them, do they do any shots? And they could probably say, yes, I have shots on top of the bottles that I have. And then you ask them, do you think that you're an alcoholic? And they'll probably say, no, I'm not. So I guess it really is about that individual's perspective. For me, I kind of define an addiction in 4 different ways. So if I'm working with someone, I often use the analogy of Gollum from Lord of the Rings. Not to say that they look like Gollum, because that would be offensive, but in terms of that behaviour around the idea that I love it, I hate it, I want to get rid of it, no I don't, yes I do, and I think people really get that. So I think from a kind of metaphorical perspective, that's how I would define an addiction. It's that kind of relationship where you feel as though it gives you everything, but it also takes things away from you at the same time. And certainly from my perspective, I think it's something that a person may have control over initially, but then becomes dependent on it as a way to cope with daily life. Certainly from a Māori perspective, I think of it as an internal and external separation from the hingingaro, which is the mind, the wairo, the spirit, tinana, the physical, and the whānau. So, and I can often see that with people, that you can see those different separations occurring out. And I guess if I was going to be sartorial, I guess I would also see an addiction as a form of income that pays my bills, because that's what I do.
You're doing very well at it. So you go out on a Saturday night, have your 20 drinks, then after that you settle back into your normal routine of life, versus someone who drinks a bottle or 2 bottles of wine a day and never misses a beat. Who's the alcoholic?
Okay, an alcoholic is not a term I like to use, because I find it quite derogatory.
Do you?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's a labeling thing. So what I like to use is binge drinker.
Binge drinker.
Or dependent drinker, harmful drinker, hazardous drinker. And I'll explain. So the New Zealand population, you're quite right, about 80% of the New Zealand population drinks. Yeah?
Yeah.
That I'm part of that. And the majority do not drink in a harmful manner.
Well, I think there's something, a really interesting difference between drinking heavily and getting pissed, getting drunk. And the cultural value, how much we celebrate drunkenness, is really interesting, because I remember being a little skinny guy at Rossmini College, and every weekend, if you didn't get plastered, you weren't a real man. It was a real sense that if drunkenness had a huge cultural value. It had status involved, it had all sorts of links with masculinity and things. And so it wasn't just enough to go out and drink a bit. It was I mean, if you didn't get pissed on a Saturday night, you're nothing. You're not part of the action. And that was a strong, I don't know, probably most men grew up in that, and maybe more recently women have shifted into that zone. But something's happening. Something's happening with alcohol which we don't understand. And in the last 10 years at our school, we've had 10,000 students being asked about their drinking in schools. And there's been a consistent drop in people's engagement with drunkenness and heavy drinking, and against all the odds. I mean, the promotion of alcohol, the targeting of young people, the diverse ways in which the industry is engaging people hasn't got any weaker, but they're not engaging the same way. And I think what's going on is that young people are socialising differently, and I would say that social media has had a lot to do with how social networks are established. And I see that, I don't agree with the idea that we're becoming less connected. I think that Facebook and other social media platforms have provided enormous opportunity for. I look at my kids now and the degree to which they organise their social life, to a point that I wonder if my allegiance to getting pissed has, drunkenness has lost its mojo.
So I was, up until 2 weeks ago, working with 3 17-year-olds that did a lot of binge drinking, and the rationale behind it was because they didn't have a job, they had dropped out of school, and they were trying to find their way forward. And so for them, binge drinking was a way of forgetting their pain and suffering. That for them was why they did what they did. That's why they sculled as fast as they could get pissed as fast as they could, just to enjoy that feeling. And as we know, human beings are all geared towards having pleasant feelings. That's what our brains are designed to do. Of course, the reality is when that alcohol's gone and you wake up with a massive migraine, your problem is still there. But I find working with those particular groups, the alcohol really is just the icing on a very complex cake, and for me can often be symptomatic of other things that are happening within the whānau.
Where does the panel stand on prohibition of drugs? I know it's a broad question, but where do we stand? Is it something that we should start to relax the laws around, Brody?
Well, I actually feel quite strongly about it. I just don't understand why try and enforce a law that doesn't actually work. you know, I've never known anyone that said, oh no, I'm not going to use that substance because it's illegal. It's, you know, so I just don't understand it. So.
But couldn't you say that about any law? People don't say, you know, people go out and murder. I mean, laws in themselves don't work because people still break them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're talking about, you know, people being caught with minimal drugs, you know, and that can affect their livelihood, their career, access to your children, travelling visas. You know, I've sat with people who try to do an application to go to university, employment, you've got a drug charge, forget it. You know, they won't even give you a second chance, a second glance. So I think in some aspects that some forms of drugs should be decriminalised.
When a drug is properly used, it's very hard to you end up with a lot of people criminalised by it because in normal life the use is quite acceptable. And we went through an interesting, internationally people were very interested in how we handle the BZPs, which were the ingredients in party pills. I don't know if you remember back in 2000 that there was no restrictions, so we had complete open policy around it. And then we tried to introduce, the government tried to introduce for a weeny bit of time regulating it. So there was regulations on advertising of the BZP party pills. There was regulation of age limits of buying it. And it was really interesting how fast it took off in terms of advertising and all the sort of practices that the liquor industry did. And then government lost its nerve after 2 years and just went back to prohibition. And the rest of the world was watching us because the new law is, the government's looking at, is there some way that there is an in-between prohibition and total open season? You know, is there somewhere in between that we should be looking at other than alcohol? Alcohol's, you know, alcohol and tobacco, I suppose. The alcohol and tobacco they're highly regulated and they're available. Could cannabis go, or could other forms of party pills go into that middle slot of regulation rather than prohibition? And I think people are watching us how we handle that.
It's a conversation worth having, isn't it, Susanna?
Yes, it is. I mean, but at the expense of sounding a little bit too radical, but I'm all up for prohibition. When I look at alcohol and tobacco and the harm that we experience from that, it's not something that I'd be able to live with. I'm up for prohibition. What I'm also up for is that the punishment, let's call it this way, that results from prohibition does not need to be always as severe as it is. So you could divert people into treatment. We need to invest more in treatment. A lot of studies show us that $1 that you spend in treatment saves $10 for the country. So why not divert those people into treatment and get them on the recovery journey?
Yeah,
Arnie,
I mean,
you wanted to
there
say
are more
something?
brown people represented in the prisons, and it's this colonised framework that doesn't work for brown people. And these, you know, Pākehā laws that you write up, Palangi laws, they just don't break it down for our people. So, and when you talk about things like, you know, building more prisons, I mean, there's the drug court, for example, and I'm sure, you know, my Odyssey brother here can speak of that experience, how it's set up as a holistic approach for people who have issues, you know, who have, have huge addictions with drugs and alcohol.
And I just want to go back to your question earlier on. Is there a system that perpetuates cycles of addiction? You mentioned the DSM earlier on. I think that is a system that perpetuates cycles of addiction. You know, I know people that have got dependencies on medications because that's you know, I heard someone say earlier on that it's kind of like being a diabetic and you have to take these pills for the rest of your life to manage. I was one of those people that was told that story, and you know, if I bought into that belief system, I'd still be on those antipsychotics right to this day, but I'm not, and it's not the only way that ahead in life. Yeah.
Peter.
Well, Suzanne is going to hate me for this, but I think there's good reason to be suspicious of the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the medical system, because if you look at the history of, I mean, I think the anxiety and antidepressants are really important when people have very serious conditions, but to some extent the medical world has created a range of labels that lead people into engaging perhaps prematurely in their use, and we saw that during the 60s and 70s and 80s with the Valium or with the benzodiazepines, when that was being promoted by the pharmaceutical industry in league with the general practice, and we ended up with heaps of people who are still, even now 40 years later, still trying to find ways out of that addiction. And ironically, they're dependent on their medical practitioners for a route out of that. And the rise of the antidepressants, particularly the SRIs now, which is like Prozac and others now, and the overprescribing of that, and the other one, I guess, that's really worrying is Ritalin, particularly in the States where you've got very high usages. I'm not saying that they don't have really important function, but when you start to create labels and people and prescribe, it's very hard to get out of that space when they become part of family life. Another group that's really important in this mix is community groups, and you know that half of our, I mean, this is something I like to do, which is to say, all right, half the money from pokies is coming from problem gamblers, half the money. So, okay, I've got $20 here. I'm not giving any of you, but just let's say I've got it here and $20 here. So half of this money is coming from people having fun, having a flutter, and half's coming from people whose lives are misery. Okay, the problem is it's all together. So when your local school, when your local sports club, when your local charity, when your local ambulance gets money from these trusts, they're picking, what you'd like to do is just, I just want the happy money, I don't want the misery money, but you've got both, hey? So when you take that money, you're increasing the demand for those spaces, those little funny little rooms we have in bars, to keep generating the yield that we all depend on. How many schools now, how many of our charities, I don't know if your organisation receives pokey money, but it's become so integral to our lives now, and that's what's keeping this addictive behaviour spreading. So I think we, like with tobacco, like with alcohol, we need to look very carefully at the relationship between the industries involved and governments, and how governments have been influenced by these industries. The last liquor reform bill produced very little in terms of what might be effective in public health. What's going on there? How are our local politicians being influenced by the industry? I think these are really, really critical questions for our field, and that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Our system does promote this because there's people out there who are constantly trying to find something that appeals to people. And of course, if you're addicted to something, then you need it, you're going to use it, you're going to buy it, you want it more and more. It could be comics, it could be anything. But that's what they're looking for, so it will always be there. So the trick is, we need to educate our communities to say no.
To say no. How do you do that when you have the allure of the filthy lucre?
Well,
is it prohibition again?
No, I'm talking more about education here. So I'm talking about our young people. And if you teach them that, look, it's not what it looks like, this is what it can do, they will try it, yes, because that's who we are, we try things, but then they will learn.
We work with, there's other social agencies, we work with Auckland City Mission, the Homeless Outreach Support Team, Lifewise, the homeless team, and there's Māori, people who are still sniffing glue, and there's no rehab for them. So what's your answer to that? Sniffing glue was something of the 80s.
There's lots of support out there. I mean, if they come to CADS, we'll see them. If they go to Odyssey, they'll be seen. So it's not that there's no treatment out there. Perhaps there's not enough treatment out there.
I just want to point out, I had the privilege of sitting in and witnessing the drug courts process last week, and I think awesome system. I just want to point out it's just a pilot program. They're capped at 50 cases per courts. There's 2 courts. So yeah, and there's not allowed to be a waiting list for those programs. They're full. They're awesome, fantastic programs. I think it's $1.9 million that's dedicated to that pilot. Then the problem is there's not enough treatment spaces for people. There really isn't.